So I appreciate it. My name is Damaris, president of the Chatham Library, and together with Jen McCreary, who's the director, we have had a very nice spring event, and we will not be having anything for July and August. We'll start back up again in September. So I hope you all sign the sheet that was near the door so that you can get our information if you are not already on the email. I'd like to introduce Hugh Howard. He's going to be speaking about architects of the American landscape, the architect that apparently has been somewhat forgotten, who worked with Frederick Law Olmsted all these years. And thanks to Howard, he's going to be back in our understanding.
One hopes.
And he's going to be having an interview with David Cutiback, who is a retired magazine writer and editor and has been a resident of Red Rock for over 30 years and a good friend. He's a member of our Friends of the Chatham Library Board and of the Spencer County Academy. And I also want to thank the Chatham Bookstore for being a continuing partner to our events, and they have the book available for purchase. Thank you very much.
I just want to echo Damaris's welcome and thanks for coming. A few years ago, I actually had the occasion to watch Hugh practice his profession. Going back a number of years, many of you will remember Red Rock had a house tour, and Hugh was the docent at our house, and he pointed out to visitors that the hardware, the latches on all the doors were original, which made them from 1840s or thereabouts. And so I filed that away someplace. Fast forward, Diane and I are painting upstairs, which is to say Diane is painting upstairs, and my job is to move the furniture, make sure things are covered, clean up afterward, which I did. And remove the hardware from all the doors. Painting's done. Diane did another wonderful job, and I clean everything up and toss it along with the 1840s hardware. Panic, right? There's no doghouse bigger or darker than the one I was headed to. But so I called Hugh, who was, I guess, over on Route 5 at that point. I knew he had a shed in the back where he wrote. I knew there was a drawer with all kinds of spare parts and things, and surely he could help me with this. Well, not initially. All right, so I went home, and soon there was an email from Hugh which had the original patent application for that door latch that he had, with the historian's tenacity, found and sent me a copy, which didn't do me a hell of a lot of good. But he fell back on the historian's tool, eBay. Had I tried eBay? I went on eBay, there it was. $50 later, I was out of the doghouse. Anyway, that was my introduction to Hugh the historian. One thing I wanted to ask you, those of us who know you, you've written a lot about architecture, about Jefferson, about Frank Lloyd Wright, a whole gamut. What is it about architecture, about buildings, that appeals to you, and how does it inform the way you look at history?
Well, actually, your anecdote about the Blake's patent latch, which I guess is the correct name of what the
See, he's going to correct me already.
The Hawaiian latch. That actually is a perfect entree, because I think one of the things that's happened in the last 50, 75 years amongst historians is we've stopped talking entirely about powerful, rich white guys, and we started talking about not only other people, not only women and the enslaved and children and so forth, But we've also started talking about material culture in a very serious way. You couldn't get a PhD in material culture half a century ago. Now you can. Because we realized, I think, that one of the ways we can think about the past is through the physical circumstances within which people lived. And you can go to Jefferson's Monticello, for example, and you will come away understanding the man and his imagination all the better for going there. So I think that some mix of, personal inclination, because I happen to think in 2 or 3 dimensions, so architecture makes sense to me, and an interest in the past made architecture a kind of logical place for me to invest some of my writing energies. I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned at one point that there's kind of an interesting backstory or origin story to this particular project.
Yeah. As you said, I've written about Jefferson, and I've written about Wright, a couple of books each, and about a whole bunch of other architects. But if you look at the sort of timeline of American architecture, there are 3 architects who really stand out head and shoulders above all the other American architects: Jefferson, Wright, and Henry Hobson Richardson. And Henry Hobson Richardson is not a household name. I bet there are relatively few of you in the room who could, unless you've read the book, give me much more than a sentence or 2 about Richardson. And I said to my editor, having done the Wright stuff, having done the Jefferson stuff, how about if we do Richardson? And he said to me, after I'd given him this pitch, he said, well, that's great, but if nobody knows who the hell the guy is, who's going to buy your book? Which is, from a publisher standpoint, as well as an author standpoint, a fairly essential question. So he and I put our heads together and talked a little more, and I went back to the library and back to sources and so forth, and I discovered that Richardson's great collaborator and his great friend was Frederick Law Olmsted. So I proposed to my editor that I do a dual biography of Richardson and Olmsted, and so here we are.
Okay. So who are these guys?
Well, let me start with Olmsted, because he's a little older. He was born, as it says there, in 1822. He, Connecticut Yankee, grew up in fact, one of his ancestors named Olmsted was an original settler in Hartford, Connecticut. His father ran a very successful dry goods business. And he grew up with all of the expectations of a good Connecticut Yankee. He was going to go to Yale. He was going to do something good with his life. And then, for reasons that, he really should have known better, he took a tumble. He took a header into a stand of poisoned sumac and got an incredibly intense case of blisters around his eyes. And it was the thinking of the docs that he consulted that he really couldn't, and he was 15 at the time, which is the moment where you really have to sort of buckle down and spend a couple of years studying very hard in order to pass the entrance exams for Yale. That was the way it worked in the 1830s and 40s. And the doc said, well, you really shouldn't be studying very much. This is not a time for you because you are putting your vision at risk if you do so. So instead of that, he did any number of other things for a period of a number of years, which did not involve going to college. He worked as a surveyor. He went to the Orient on a ship as a sailor. He came back and got involved with some publishing activity. He wrote he was a farmer. He wrote some very interesting tour books. And only kind of by accident in his middle 30s did he end up getting hired to be superintendent of Central Park, which was at that point not a park. It was some land that had been acquired by the town fathers in order to create a park. And he not only superintended the design of the park, but he also, along with a man named Calvert Vaux, designed the park, came up with the conception. And it was the first significant city park in the United States. I mean, we think of parks as being a fixed place in many, many, many cities. There were none at that point. So that's sort of his backstory, the launch of his career. Shall I do Richardson?
Sure.
Can I go ahead with this? Oh, there we go. He was born 16 years later. He was born in New Orleans, a very opposite fellow in any number of different ways. He decided he wanted to be an engineer when he was a very smart young man. He had a three-dimensional imagination. He was someone who could play multiple games of chess in his head without a board in front of him. So it tells you something about his vision, his thinking. He decided he wanted to be an engineer, and at that point, the only engineering school in the country was West Point. So he applied to West Point, got recommendations from some significant people, not the least of whom was Jefferson Davis, not so long thereafter to be president of the Confederacy. And he was rejected because he had an interview and he had a stutter, he had a halt in his speech. And some wise man at West Point said, people who have halts in their speech really aren't officer material. So he didn't get to do that. But he did spend a year at University of Louisiana, which subsequently became Tulane after a man named Paul Tulane gave him a lot of money, and spent a year there before transferring to Harvard. And while he was at Harvard, he decided that he wanted to use this, skill, this set of capabilities that he had to be an architect. So he went to Paris immediately after graduating from Harvard, having made lots and lots of rich friends at Harvard who would later on be extremely useful to him in terms of clients, in terms of getting jobs, architectural commissions. Spent several years in Paris during the Civil War, partly because had he come home to serve in the Confederacy, he would have been shooting his rifle at his Harvard friends, or had he served for the Union Army, he would have been shooting at literally his brother, who was an officer in the Confederacy. So he established himself in Paris as a trainee, did both work for an architectural firm and study at the École des Beaux-Arts before returning in 1865 to New York. He could have gone to Boston, could have gone to New Orleans, but instead chose New York because I think he wanted to do it on his own. And it was there that Olmsted and Richardson met and began to design and work together in various ways.
I was interested, going back to Olmsted for a second, he had a pretty remarkable CV. There was the sanitary commission that he ran during the Civil War, which is fascinating. And I never associated Olmsted with Yosemite. To me, Yosemite was John Muir. I mean, yes. Which is true, except
Right.
Olmsted had gone to work for the Mariposa Mining Company? Was that how that worked?
Well, Olmsted was a cranky guy, and he really didn't like people who didn't like what he was doing, people who would interfere with him. And so he had endless problems with bureaucrats, starting in New York. Because, among other things, he was designing this wonderful park, and some idiot wants to tell him he has to hire someone who's a political appointee who has no skills. And he put up with this for years. And then at a certain point, at the beginning of the Civil War, he said, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. I'm actually going to go do something useful for my country. And he spends 2 years running the sanitary commission, as you alluded to, which was essentially the medical corps for the military, because the military didn't really have a medical corps. And of course, with 750,000 dead in the course of the war, they needed plenty of medical care. And he engineered the creation of a system that brought bandages and surgeons and equipment to the front lines. So he did that for a couple of years. But then he began to get a little tired of the bureaucracy that was telling him how to do that. So somebody offered him a job at Mariposa. And he went out to try and reorganize a gold mine, a set of gold mines in Mariposa. And while he was there, he fell in love with the countryside around him, not the least of which was Yosemite, which was actually a fairly long ride, some 40 miles, accessible only by horseback at that point. You couldn't even get a carriage in there. And he thought it was stunning and managed to get himself appointed by the governor to a commission that did a report that described what Yosemite was, because it was effectively unknown at that point. Fewer than 1,000 people of European ancestry had ever visited Yosemite at that point. It was known to Native Americans forever. It was this antediluvian place. But he wrote a report that became something of a foundation stone for the establishment of the Park Service in later years, and it was very valuable in California persuading itself that it should be conserved initially as a state park.
Excuse me. Cranky. I'm just remembering, going back to Richardson for a second, how I think he much preferred institutional clients to individual clients. You would think that he would be averse to dealing with institutional bureaucracies, but no, he much preferred that to some rich patron who wanted to tell him what to do. Is that fair?
Actually, I think Richardson, he certainly had his moments when his clients, he liked all his clients when they let him do what he wanted to do for them. He was less keen on them when they started to interfere and say, let's do this instead. But he had I don't know if you can get any sense from this portrait, which was painted just in the last year of his life. He was a man of great goodwill, of immense charm. He was a wonderful storyteller. He loved to eat. He loved to drink. He loved to tell stories. And I think that he, by dint of charm as much as anything else, persuaded, as well as his architectural genius, of course. I mean, his ideas were good. He wanted to build wonderful buildings, and he was able to persuade the people that he dealt with, for the most part, to follow his lead. And I think Olmsted was different in that he was not that Richardson was an aesthete to the exclusion of practical things, although there's something to be said for that. But Olmsted was someone who, at heart, I think he was really a sociologist and a student of democracy. And he felt that what he was doing was for the good of the common weal. He was creating beautiful places. He was creating these parks that we know and like and enjoy. But he was also giving people of the lower classes an opportunity to be exposed to what he called the scenic, which he thought was the life-giving, health-giving energy of the natural world. And when he was born, I'm wandering off on a tangent here.
That's okay. That's what we're here for, right? Tangents.
When he was born in 1822, everybody lived within a mile of the countryside. Even in Manhattan, even if you lived in Manhattan or in Philadelphia or any city, you could, if you walked half an hour, you could find yourself in a pasture, you could find yourself in forest, you could find yourself in the natural world where you could have a nature experience, if you will. In Olmsted's lifetime, the American population increased eightfold. Many of those folks, in fact, probably most of those folks, were related to the cities, were somehow living or working in cities. And as a consequence of that, these parks became absolutely essential places for people who were not able to reach nature. If you were rich, you could always go to the Adirondacks for a month. If you had a work-a-day job and you were working 6 days or 6.5 days a week, maybe you could go to the park, but you weren't going to be going out to the Jersey Shore.
So this whole notion of urbanization, and I made this word up, but suburbanization is critical to a lot of the work, not only Richardson, but of their work together. There's the board.
Yeah, actually, why don't we just quick, why don't I do a couple of, we're intending to have these sort of rolling in the background, but I'm afraid my technological abilities are narrower than they might be. So, so this is Richardson's Trinity Church, which is his most best remembered work. That may come up later in the conversation. Central Park, that's the plan it was actually executed by Olmsted and Box himself in Box's apartment in New York. Again, Central Park. A house that they did in Waltham, Massachusetts called Stonehurst. An insane hospital that they designed in Buffalo that still stands. This is a contemporary photograph. It's actually a hotel called the Hotel Henry in honor of Henry Hobson Richardson. A town hall that Dave Cooper, among others, could tell you all about, having just been there yesterday. The Gate Lodge, arguably Richardson's most famous house. And library, a house in Chicago, Albany, just up the street here, which Richardson had something to do with, as did Olmsted. A monument that was a Richardson work. And here we are at Yosemite with Frederick Law Olmsted right there, along with a bunch of other folks, obviously. Anyway, this is where I was going, which is the railroad station. Again, you know, if we have a place, if we have a land where people don't commute back and forth to suburbs because the suburbs don't exist, and then all of a sudden the population gets more dense, and they, because of railroads, because of other transportation opportunities, they can get out of town, they begin living in suburbs, they need to commute back and forth. And most of the original subway stations, not subway stations, train stations that were built in suburbs in the Boston area were designed by Henry Hobson Richardson and landscaped by Olmsted. Because again, this was a whole new thing, and they had to create a mechanism, had to create welcoming portals, if you will, for people who were leaving town and going home at the end of the day to their houses.
Now, that's an interesting example, because here is the case, as I understand it, where the client who owned the Boston-Albany Railroad was what you would call a co-conspirator. He was very much part of this, this particular achievement. He had his own notions about, you know, how people should be comfortable in his railroad. And
yes, yeah, absolutely. And until Richardson designed a set of railroad stations like this, you would arrive in a suburb and you get off, and there might be a box-like building there, but it wouldn't be welcoming in any sense. And unlike this, where if it's a rainy day, you stand under the shed. If it's a cold day, there's a big hearth and a big fireplace inside. You can wait for your train. So it was intended to encourage customers of the Boston and Albany Railroad to use their services as people began to shift their lives from the suburbs, because it became possible to go back and forth. Only rich people 50 years before, even 15 years before, have been able to live in the country and work in Boston, because they would have to have a carriage, they would have to have facilities for their horses, they would have to, and the average workaday guy could not do that. When the railroad was available and you could take a train back and forth for 15 cents each way, that was a pretty good deal.
we have a building quite similar to that right over here. Yes?
We do indeed. In fact, that was designed, Richardson died relatively young at 47. And he left a successor firm called Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, which designed the Chatham Rail Station. And that is it's not a Richardson building, but it's a Richardson Romanesque building. It could easily have fallen from his imagination had he lived another year or two to design it. Mm-hmm. So if you want, in your own mind, want to get a picture of what Richardson Romanesque is like, I mean, yes, it's a little bit like Romanesque churches of the 12th and 13th century in France, but it's also like the Chatham Rail Station.
Why Romanesque? What was it about Romanesque that appealed to? Because the standard was classical, was Greek architecture, basically.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. I'm not sure I ever. I don't think he ever put on paper a nice, cogent 1 or 2 or 5 sentences saying why. On the other hand, he loved the materials, he loved the stone, he loved carving. He was, you know, the part of his artistic imagination was very three-dimensional. He really thought of things in those terms. And I think also he was somebody who thought of buildings from the inside out. And I think that the asymmetry, I think the kind of randomness of some of those buildings might have fed into that piece, but that's pure conjecture.
Sticking with the times, you characterize the times as overly decorated, and that Richardson succeeded in turning down the visual volume of this over-decorated age.
I think he did. I think that partly it was his use of stone. I think it was partly that he, together with Olmsted, thought about how buildings fit into their places, which I think had very significant long-term influence on a number of people, not least Frank Lloyd Wright. I don't think Frank Lloyd Wright was a guy who, I'm segueing slightly here, but he was a guy who always said, nobody taught me how to do anything. I'm my own guy. I'm a complete original. Which of course was not true, but you know, when you're a narcissist, you can sometimes get away with saying and believing things like that. But he did, with some regularity, you know, at least half a dozen times in the course of his life, say, I'm really kind of indebted to Henry Hobson Richardson. And in fact, I think that indebtedness, even if he didn't entirely realize it, was to both Richardson and Olmsted. Because Wright's, well, if you think about prairie style houses, they sit there long and low on the prairie. Well, and they have nice long, low roof lines. This could be a Wright building, except it's a little bit more elemental maybe, but I think that Wright was deeply influenced by Richardson's use of certain motifs from the Romanesque arches. You know, those, we think of them as Wrightian arches. Well, they're Richardsonian arches. The long, low roof, same thing. So I think there's a kind of continuity there that bespeaks of the originality of his work and how he separated himself from, at that point, the very conventional and very kind of standard colonial style buildings that we think of. Not to mention the Victorian period, which was just all over the place.
You're right. And that's, when you think about overly decorated, that's what I.
Yes, absolutely.
Since we are meandering, let's dial back just because I found this interesting. The whole business of Olmsted and Niagara Falls, sort of in a preservationist.
Yes. Now, Niagara Falls was had fallen on kind of difficult times when Olmsted and to a lesser degree Richardson and to a greater degree Frederick Edwin Church, who of course has this marvelous Solana house down the road a piece from here, got involved with an effort to conserve it. Among other things, at that point, it was surrounded by factories because it was this wonderful source of power. You know, there's a lot of energy in the water that pours out those falls. In fact, today, the falls that we look at, we're only seeing about half of the water that's actually coming down the river and dropping at Niagara Falls because so much of it is powering turbines. So we're not seeing what a Native American would have seen 1,000 years ago, or the first folks who went to look at it, first Europeans who arrived. And Olmsted saw this wonderful place that he thought was in just ruinous condition, and he said, we need to do something about this. And he was on a committee along with Church and along with a number of other folks who again did a report and persuaded the powers that be in Albany that they should turn it into a state conservation area, which they did. Gradually, the factories went away, and gradually it was returned to some semblance of the astonishing natural place that it is. Yeah. So it's a world-renowned place. You know, there were a lot of Europeans who had no desire to come to America, but the Europeans who did come to America, one of the very top places on the list was Niagara Falls in the 19th century because it was such an astonishing natural phenomenon, even in its somewhat degraded state.
There was that painting.
Yes.
You could actually pay money to see a painting of Niagara Falls.
That's right.
And it was a huge hit in Europe as well as.
That's right. Yeah, Church's painting, Niagara, literally did travel across Europe, and it was a great picture was the term of art they used at the time. They would set it up in a gallery. It would be the only picture in the gallery. The gallery would be darkened. It would be, would be framed by a proscenium art, sometimes with curtains or portieres. People would, and there'd be benches in front of it. People would pay 2 bits to come in and sit in front of it and have the experience of the falls. If they couldn't go to Buffalo, New York, they could have it downtown Manhattan or in London or in Dusseldorf.
Right, right. You'll forgive me if I read something, but it's a quote that really I love. The critic, Louis Mumford, had written about Richardson, whom he described as the first American architect to face the totality of modern life. The first American architect to deal with the totality of modern life.
Mm.
That's quite a claim.
It is indeed. Well, I think that among other things, we can describe Richardson as a form giver. That is to say, there were no suburban railroad stations until he came along. Until he came along, there were essentially no freestanding public libraries. Until 1850, you couldn't go anywhere and take a book out of the library. It's just, if you were at a university, if you were a member of a certain kind of club, if you had a pal who had a nice library, maybe. But there was no such thing as a public library. And the notion was promulgated in the 1850s that would be a good thing. And a few libraries were established, maybe upstairs in an apothecary downtown, or maybe in City Hall or something. But there were no freestanding buildings that were libraries until Richardson came along and was commissioned to design half a dozen of them that became paradigms that were then copied many, many other places. So I think what Mumford was talking about was Richardson's ability to take on a new challenge like the suburban train station and libraries, and create paradigms, create examples that then other people could vary or copy and use. These were new things that hadn't previously been needed, and he would create ways that, answers, come up with solutions.
And the Buffalo State Hospital would fall into that, because it's a whole different way of seeing the insane.
Yes.
Maybe known.
The hospital, the Buffalo Hospital for the Insane, which was built in the 1870s and 80s, is almost half a mile long. It was this absolutely immense building. We got to go back here and find it. And it's, right, there we go. Let's go back. It consists of an administrative building in the center, which is impressive and tall and has offices and a mix of meeting rooms and so forth. And it's flanked by, on each side, a set of 5 separate structures, each of which is set back from the previous structure and connected by a little curved hyphen. And it's designed so that women who were admitted to the hospital were in one set of wings, men were in the other set of wings. And each of the wings was segregated by the level of problem that each of the patients had. So that, if you were stark, raving, screaming mad, you were going to be in one place. If you were just slightly depressed, you'd be in another place. And there was an emphasis on light. There was an emphasis on living, again, a relatively quiet life exposed to the natural world, which Olmsted designed the landscape for this, by the way, and Richardson designed the building. So it was one of their most interesting collaborations. And Olmsted in particular had a notion that people would get healthier if they led a disciplined life, where they would eat at regular times and they would sleep at regular times. If they had some discipline in their lives so they could work on the farm. So that we're looking at the street side of this building. There was an enormous set of acres behind it that was essentially the farm that provided food to feed the people, but also a way for these folks who are trying to reassemble their lives to work in the fields and make a useful contribution to their little community here. And by the way, it worked. Something like 2/3 of folks who were admitted to this hospital and others like it went home and became useful members of society. So even if they didn't have magic drugs and they didn't have the ideas of Freud, they, at least with the relatively simple challenges that some of these people had, they could offer some situation where they could recover.
Now, so this reminds me, as magnificent as this is, it's what goes on behind it is probably much more interesting and maybe even more important. He built homes like this as well. Was it was it the Pullman's mansion?
The Glessner house?
The Glessner house, where there's nothing but a wall facing the street, which drove his other neighbors on Millionaires Road nuts. Because they had these beautiful Victorian homes, and across the street there was this massive wall.
Yeah.
But behind that was a whole, again,
That's right.
a whole different world.
Yeah. This is the interior courtyard
Yeah.
at the John J. Glessner House, which is in Chicago. So it's a museum. Next time you're in Chicago, go have a look. It's really very interesting house, full of interesting decorative arts from the late 19th century. But the other side of this looks like a fortress. It really does. You know, it's stone. It has relatively small openings. In fact, most of the small openings open only into either servants' quarters or to hallways that service the rest of the house. So the whole focus of the house is away from the streetscape. Now, it was a somewhat intimidating time in Chicago. There was some violence in the streets, so there was a kind of sociological logic to this. But Richardson's solution was, as you say, to have the one facade serve a very different purpose than the opposite.
You speak of them as ultimately soulmates, some sort of a Vulcan mind meld or something. And they were rather different. The highly educated Richardson, the self-taught Olmsted, temperamentally, my sense is they were quite different, but there was something about them that attracted them to each other professionally or artistically.
Yes, yeah. I wish, as an historian, writing about the past as I do, I'm really only as good as the surviving primary materials. And in the case of Olmsted, he wrote voluminously. There is literally I forget the words, 13 or 14 volume set of his papers, copiously edited, beautifully annotated. Those are selected papers. That's probably a fifth or a tenth of what he wrote, probably because he was forever writing reports. He would say to him, we need a park for downtown Chatham, and he would write you a 50-page report that said, this is why you should do it. It's going to enhance real estate values. It's going to be good for the children, whatever. He'd write these very long things. So he did lots of reports, but he was also a mad correspondent with wonderful connections with all kinds of people around the world. Richardson wrote almost nothing. Richardson wrote plans, he scribbled notes. He probably wrote more than we know because not all of his papers were conserved as well as Olmsted's were. Olmsted's ancestors did a fantastic job of holding on to his paperwork. So the exact dynamic of their relationship is a little hard to know, but one of the testimonies, I think, to the kind of relationship they had was that when Richardson died, again, relatively young, Olmsted said, we cannot forget this man. He is too important to forget. And he commissioned a woman to write what was the first biography ever of an American architect, which was published in 1888, Henry Hobson Richardson and his works, was the title of the book. Which I think that was a loving gesture. I think it was a gesture that served Olmsted's sense of history and importance, as well as his friendship. But I think there's a quote that I actually used as the epigraph to the book, which I think kind of says it all from Olmsted's perspective, which is, I cannot express or make those who did not know him even dimly understand how much Richardson was in one's life, how much help and comfort he gave one in its work. He was the greatest comfort and the most potent stimulus that has ever come into my artistic life. I think pretty powerful words.
Yeah. Yeah.
And let me add one more thing, and that is that I also think, and this is not on the basis of anything that they said about each other, but I think Olmsted was a somewhat closed down, never very healthy man who didn't have a great capacity for happiness, I don't think. I think he had an immense amount of energy. He worked incredibly hard. He had scruples. He had values that were really important. And Richardson was just this, he walked into a room and the lights came on. And I think that somehow that worked for Olmsted and vice versa. Now, exactly the dynamic of that, it's very hard to say, but it's clearly there from, from what Olmsted himself said.
I think my numbers are right, but they'll be close enough and you won't know the difference. But in 1885, 75 prominent architects in the United States were polled. What are the 10 most important buildings in America? On the list of 10, 5 were Richardson's building. Fast forward, not that many years, and he's gone.
That's right.
Literally and figuratively, to be sure.
Yes.
But how is it just a matter of taste change, or?
Yeah, I flipped to this because they were asked to order their top 10 buildings, and this was the top. And actually, it was 7 out of 10.
Oh my goodness.
So, well, it's a great question. I think that taste was part of it. I think part of it was that he was gone. I've had this conversation. There's a man named James O'Gorman who's written, 10 books about Henry Hobson Richardson. He's the dean of the Richardson Scholars. And I had lunch with him at some point when I was doing research in this, and I said, where do you think he would have gone? And Jim said, I think he was done. I don't think he was going to do it, which I just think is so wrong. And so it's such a disservice to Richardson, because in his last 24 months, he did several just really, really important buildings that were wildly influential, that were copied all over the place. So I think the biggest single reason that he was forgotten is that, unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who left behind 500 built works and had a career of almost 60 years, including 3 quite discrete 20-year periods where he did kind of different things in distinctly different styles, Richardson had one activity period of roughly 15 years and was survived by only 80 buildings, of which probably a third are gone. So I think that the lack of work out there, the lack of exposure, the shortness of his career, and changing tastes, clearly, and that was another part of it. And the American architecture did kind of revert to what had come before, because we always liked capes. We always liked Georgian houses. When we think of a colonial style house with the door in the middle, flanked by 2 windows, 2 on each side, and 5 openings up above, we still build 1 million of those every year. So Richardson's moment was an aberration, and I guess he didn't live long enough to make it stick.
Mm-hmm. Do you have this, and I'll put you on the spot, do you have a favorite Richardson building?
Yeah. Well, I have to admit, I've never been to the Buffalo Hospital, so I really want to go out there and have a look.
We can arrange that.
This is pretty remarkable. Yeah. I go to Boston with some regularity, and every Wednesday night they have a. I'm not a person of I'm an agnostic person, put it that way. So church isn't something that I do with regularity, but they have a sung service every Wednesday night at Trinity, and it's fantastic. Great building, fun to be in, fun to look at, and it's a wonderful public space because it's right there in Copley Square, and there are people parked in front of it. It just looks like it belongs there, and it also has the great asset that I.M. Pei, or his firm, designed the John Hancock Tower right next to it. So there's this great big mirrored reflection. So there's kind of like 2 Trinities there, which is kind of magical.
Enough about us. Questions for Hugh?
How did Vaux and Hobson, was there a bit of a competition there, or a resentment, or any kind of...
I don't think so. I don't know that they ever worked together. I think that Olmsted and Vaux got together partly because they were, fans of Andrew Jackson Downing. And I think that their relationship started there when Olmsted was hired as superintendent of Central Park. There wasn't a plan. There was a competition to create a plan. Olmsted, again, because he didn't have any training, could not have created a plan by himself. Vaux was there. Vaux said, why don't we do it together? And they did, and the rest is Central Park history, which is fantastic. But I think that they had, Olmsted was always an independent man, and I think they had sort of separated, although they never broke up, as it were. Although I think their formal partnership ended in 1872, and most of Richardson's collaborations with Olmsted post-dated that. But I don't think there was animosity there. I think that Vaux carried on and did a lot of wonderful. He designed the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the original building there, among many, many, many other significant works. So it's a good question, but I don't have all the answers.
Darn.
Has there ever been any other example of landscape architect and an architect working together in such close partnership?
I'm sure there have been a bunch, but
it went on for at least, you said, the 15 years that Richardson was.
They did their first project together in '68, and Richardson died in '86, so something like 18 years. And by the way, it was never a legal partnership in any sense. They never hung out a shingle that said Richardson and Olmsted or vice versa. And I think it was a marriage of convenience when it kind of worked and when people brought them together, but they were very independent guys. But to answer your question, I'm sure there are many examples of this, and of course, lots of firms now have landscape architects on their staff.
But that's hired and legal kind of thing.
Right.
It sounds like partnership that they both wanted. Would it be like where one of them got a commission and the other one said, let's do this together, and brought the other one in?
Yes, to some degree. I mean, that was literally true in Boston. They were both based in New York when they first met. In fact, they were both living in a neighborhood in Staten Island called Clifton. And we don't know the specific day or the specific circumstances under which they met, but they both commuted back and forth on the ferry from the same ferry stop in Clifton to Manhattan on a more or less daily basis. Although Olmsted at that time was also working on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. So some days he went that way and some days he went this way. But they probably met either at the ferry or possibly at the Century Club, where most of the fine creative minds of New York at that point were members, and they both were. So exactly how they met, we don't know. But at some point, when Trinity was 2 years into construction, Richardson realized that he just couldn't run the show from New York, so he moved to Boston in 1874. And starting the following year, Olmsted started spending summers in Boston. Again, he was finding New York politics increasingly frustrating. And by the late 1870s, he was at work in what has become known as the Emerald Necklace in Boston, that set of parks that kind of encircles Boston proper. And I think Richardson, at least some of the time, before Olmsted moved to Boston, and moved, by the way, to a house, a 2-minute walk from Richardson's house, because their wives are friendly and their kids are friendly, and obviously they had this kind of informal collaboration going on. I think Richardson was Olmsted's eyes and ears in Boston, and I think he was, there are, of the few letters that we have between them, there are a couple that say, more or less, you better get your ass up here if you want to design Franklin Park, because it's about to happen. So come, let's have this conversation with the powers that be in Boston. Mm-hmm. So I think their relationship was an interesting and deep one, if informal.
Yeah. My question segues right to the Boston area. I was always told that the Wellesley College campus was designed by Olmsted. Did you run across that? It's a gorgeous campus.
It is. It's a lovely campus. I come across this conversation, this question in many places, because you go to places and people say, oh, my campus, my city, my park, whatever, was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And about half the time, it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the guy we're talking about. And the other half the time, it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., known as Rick, who, together with his half-brother, who was also his cousin, because Frederick Law Olmsted married his brother's widow and inherited a son named John. So he had a nephew slash stepson and a by birth son by the same mom. They inherited the practice and they ran the practice. Olmsted began to to slide into senility in about 1895, although he lived till 1903. But John ran the practice until 1925. Rick continued to run the practice until 1949. Some business named Olmsted or Olmsted Partners or Olmsted Associates survived into the 80s. So there's a lot of really good Olmsted parks out there that had nothing to do with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. And Wellesley, I think, was designed in the first decade of the 20th century, primarily by Rick.
Okay, because the college started in 1876, so
Yeah.
it would have been around the same time that he was coming into the
Right.
university.
But I think that the master plan for the college that they're responsible for is in the first, I think it's in the first decade of the 20th century.
Yeah, makes sense.
Jen?
You mentioned the public libraries that he designed, and of course, now I want to know if any of them are standing still. Can you visit any of the libraries?
Yes, yeah, they all are. They're all around Boston, with the exception of Billings, which is at the University of Vermont. But there's a little gem in Quincy. There's a very large, very handsome one in Woburn. Because at that point, when he was hired to design the public library, for the most part, there was a benefactor who was going to pay the bills, who was going to do this. And in the case of the Woburn Library, the benefactor had lots of books, but he also had an art collection, and he had a cousin who had a natural history collection. So when they built this building, it has stacks for the library and a reading room and so forth, but it also has this apse-shaped building on one end that was an art museum, and there's another section where they had the natural history collection. So it's this very interesting mix. But Quincy and Woburn, and actually there's a picture here I'll try and find, which is Malden, Massachusetts, which is also interesting because Olmsted designed the landscape, so it really sits very nicely into the streetscape. And they're really fun. Not every librarian liked what he did, by the way. You know, they don't bear a terrifically close resemblance to what we think of as a library today. You know, book stacks are very different, and they have alcoves, and there's a second floor and so forth. But they were beginning. They were important.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about Olmsted's later projects, the Biltmore, and I think he worked at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893?
Yes, yeah. He really had three great late in life commissions. You've named two. Stanford is the other. Stanford University, Leo and Stanford Junior University. Amazing. In some ways, Biltmore is the most interesting. Well, I don't know. Chicago is a fantastic story too. I don't tell and I don't know as much of the Chicago story as I might, because the focus of my book is on the Richardson and Olmsted relationship, and all three of those projects came after Richardson died. Although, interestingly, the buildings at Stanford were designed by Richardson's successor firm, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. So they are very definitely Richardson Romanesque in their way, with those low Syrian arches and so forth. In the case of Biltmore, I think that's an extraordinarily interesting story because, among other things, there really wasn't the discipline of forestry established in this country when Olmsted went down there. And George Washington Vanderbilt said to him, "I want to build a house here." And Frederick Law Olmsted, who had done some business with his family and knew him, although he was very much an eminence grise to young GW, said, "That would be great, but you don't want to do a park, do you?" And he said, "Well, I sort of like doing it." He said, "Well, land is shitty. It's really kind of ruined. So this isn't going to work as a park, but you could make it into a wonderful self-sustaining forest." And they hired the right people, future founder of the National Park Service and so forth, who created the discipline of forestry in a sense. So it's another one of his significant accomplishments. And of course, Chicago was this spectacular event that the world attended and cared about. So, and he designed the landscape, but was very critical to the whole process.
Yes.
Did you run across much about Richardson's selection for the Capitol? He was first in, right? Before Perry and he was first in.
The Capitol was underway. It was, I think, up to the second story or something or thereabouts, and it was wildly over budget. And a Buffalo politician named Dorsheimer, who was one of Richardson's and Olmsted's great patrons, said, we really got to fix this problem, and turned to Olmsted and said, what should we do? Because Olmsted was, among other things, a terrific manager. Maybe that was his, it's very hard to say which was his greatest skill, but he could look at a problem and solve it. And so he said, well, I guess we got to kind of rethink this thing. And he hired 2 architects. Richardson was one, and then Leopold Eidlitz was the other. And they set about saving a little money and saving the building and finishing the building, which they did. And there's one facade that's Richardson and one facade that's Eidlitz. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, that was okay. Yeah, I was trying to figure out his relationship to when he was engaged in capital and Eidlitz and Perry, and I couldn't remember.
Yeah, at that point, they were both Richardson and Olmsted were still living in Staten Island. And they also, interestingly, had just done a report on the future of Staten Island. Somebody said this development is happening willy-nilly around here. How are we going to fix this? How are we going to make sure that we do what we want? We don't end up ruining this beautiful place that we want. And they sat down, Richardson and Olmsted, and created a plan, which then Staten Island was completely ignored. But they'd had a relationship, I think, that led to that. I think there was, I can't tell you what the connection was, but I think that it was, having done that, it was a kind of logical, they were logical folks to go to try and solve this problem that they had in Albany.
Another question. Another question.
I guess we've answered them all, Dan.
So
I would just say, I mean, I would encourage folks, if you would like to stick around, if Mr. Howard is willing, we'd love to do a book signing after the event.
Of course. I brought my pen with me too, so I'd be happy to sign a book or two.
I would encourage folks to definitely take advantage of the books that the Chatham Bookstore has provided, and thank them again for helping us out with this event. And thank you both for this.
we're on the subject of architecture. You'll forgive me if I make a plug. Dave Cooper's here and Ginny's here. Red Rock Schoolhouse coming along. If you haven't, have a look. It's quite a magnificent project. Dave, Rusty Bazak, Mary Keegan. It's been extraordinary. We're on our way, we hope, to what, state historical?
The national and state day? Which one are we going to?
Yeah. We're going state first, and if you make state, make historical register.
Yeah.
And anyway, forgive my.
The World Series.
Yeah.
Again, thank you all for coming.
But thank you. Thanks for this, guys. Made it fun.